Over the years, a lot of people in the hacking community have tried to fix Fire Emblem 6 by applying balance patches to it to make it more streamlined, I guess you could say, easier to play, less clunky, less annoying. Now, I am of course of the idea that Fire Emblem 6 is the perfect game and you shouldn't balance it, but I do understand that not everyone is like me, and I totally get that a lot of aspects of this game can be very tedious and annoying. However, one thing that always bothers me about these so-called balance patches and balance remakes is that I feel like they go too far in one direction, and they change the game into something that is not fundamentally Fire Emblem 6. A good example of this would of course be the fan hack Project Ember that I played on the channel a little while back. While it started off great, it soon devolved into something that didn't feel like Fire Emblem 6 at all. In fact, it kind of felt like bad Fire Emblem fanfiction. Now, ever since I started working on my own Fire Emblem hack, I've been forced to learn a lot about Fire Emblem hacking, so I thought to myself, you know, why don't I sit down and actually make a Fire Emblem 6 balance patch? And I basically tried to change as little as possible because I still want it to feel like Fire Emblem 6, but I did some changes that I believe will make the game a lot better to play, at least for newer players. And yeah, in this video, I'm going to explain to you all the changes I made, and I'm also going to show you how to get this ROM for yourself if you want to go ahead and try it. So one of the changes that I've applied to the ROM is a very basic one. You can play hard mode straight from the start without needing to play on normal mode. I figured this was a nice addition because I've generally balanced the game around hard mode, so I definitely recommend you try this difficulty. Don't worry, it is nowhere near as punishing as it used to be in the early game. This is one of the biggest issues I have with vanilla FE6. Hard mode just feels incredibly overtuned early on. Enemies have very high bonuses in the earlier chapters for some reason, and I don't really know why. So what I've gone ahead and done, in addition to unlocking hard mode right from the start, is that hard mode is now generally a little bit more forgiving early on. Now, by going into Fire Emblem Builder and checking the enemy hard mode bonuses, we can see that they get a lot in the early game. The hard mode bonus starts off at +4 in Chapter 1, which I think is way too high. So I've reduced that to +1. So for comparison, this is how a fighter looks like in Chapter 1 of Fire Emblem 6 hard mode, and this is how he looks like with the new changes. So he's only slightly stronger than he was on normal mode, and as a result, enemies should be a lot more manageable. In Chapter 2, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +4 down to +2. In Chapter 3, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +5 down to +3. In Chapter 4, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +5 down to +3. In Chapter 5, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +6 down to +4. In Chapter 6, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +6 down to +4. In Chapter 7, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +7 down to +5. And in Chapter 8, I've reduced the hard mode bonuses from +7 down to +6. And from Chapter 8X and onwards, the hard mode bonuses remain unchanged, so the mid to late game will be exactly as difficult as it was before. However, from Chapter 21 and onwards, I have actually increased the enemy hard mode bonuses ever so slightly. Not by an insane amount, you're not going to see like capped enemies in the late game or anything like that, but I always thought that FE6 was a little bit front-loaded in its difficulty, and once your character started snowballing, things could get a little bit easy in the endgame, so this should provide a little bit more of a challenge for seasoned veterans. Keep in mind that this only applies to hard mode. Normal mode is going to be completely unchanged. In addition to this endgame difficulty increase, I have also taken it upon myself to increase the hard mode bonuses of some of the Gaiden chapters slightly, as some of them are just strangely undertuned with very low quality enemies. However, Chapter 8X, Chapter 16X, and Chapter 20BX are unchanged, as those are quite insane already. Another general balance change I've applied to the ROM is that I've restored all items up to their FE7 values. This means that iron axes have 75% hit now, for example. Generally speaking, this will result in a buff to most axes, but also weapons like steel lances, javelins, and hand axes. Now this does mean that the axe users of the early game will be slightly more accurate. However, they have lower stats to compensate, so this shouldn't really screw you over in the early game at all. Also, anti-cavalry weapons like the rapier now deals effective damage against nomads, troubadours, and valkyries. This is a pretty big buff to Roy, but be careful, it might also affect some of your units. I've also cut the number of turns spent required to unlock supports by half. In my opinion, this doesn't make the game easier because the cap of 50 support points per chapter is still in place, meaning you can't unlock them quicker on a chapter by chapter basis. In my opinion, there are two kinds of players: those who unlock supports in FE6 and those who doesn't. Those who are hell-bent on getting the supports will spam end turn at the end of each chapter until they get them, and all this change does is just halve the amount of turns those players will spend doing that. For those who don't care about the supports, I doubt this change will make them unlock some by accident, as Binding Blade supports still take an eternity to unlock even when they're cut in half. Also, I've made a pretty big change to Manakeets. They all have 1-2 range now, and that will make the endgame a lot harder. Dragons will actually fire back at your ranged units, and they are incredibly scary. However, this change also includes Faye, so she's a lot better now, and her Divine Stone also has more uses to boot, so you can play around with her a little bit more before she becomes irrelevant. However, with the abundance of 1-2 range Manakeets in the endgame, your legendary weapons will be more important than ever, and to help the players with that, I have increased their durability to 40 up from 20, so they can actually be played around with a little bit now without fear of them accidentally breaking and depriving you of the best ending. The Binding Blade actually has 60 uses now, but its power has been toned down a little bit to compensate, as it was a little bit too devastating against the final boss. I have also put one of each promotion item on various enemies throughout the mid-game. Binding Blade is very stingy with its crests and especially guiding rings, so I figured one more of each would come in handy. Generally speaking, they will appear as stealables on random enemies, so you will need to keep an eye out for them. Oh, and I removed practically every single ambush spawn from the game. I mean, the reinforcements still show up on the same turn, it's just they don't move the turn they show up, you get a turn to react. This isn't the case for every single reinforcement, like some of the thieves that spawn still move on the same turn that they spawn because they don't attack you anyway, but overall, I don't like ambush spawns and I don't really think they add anything to the game. Yes, some people might argue this is a nerf that will make the game easier, and I'm inclined to agree. Yes, it will definitely make the game easier, but in a good way, I think. I mean, no one really likes ambush spawns. There is a small exception to this rule. In some chapters, like chapter 6, the ambush spawns are actually coded with ASM, so I couldn't really touch those. If I tried to change them, I ended up breaking the ROM. FE6 hacking is a little bit finicky like that. However, most of these reinforcements that come out shouldn't really come out anywhere near players, so this isn't something you should worry about. Just know that there are still a few ambush spawns left in the game that I wasn't able to change. I have also generally improved the equipment of most bosses. For some reason, many bosses rarely have more than a single weapon in Binding Blade, which can make some of them quite trivial, so I've taken steps to improve that. I haven't touched many of the game's generics, but I have changed a few here and there, such as the heroes guarding the switches in Chapter 21. They can actually retaliate back at range now, which they couldn't before. Other changes includes battle preparations as early as Chapter 2. Yes, this is also a slight difficulty decrease since you can move your units around in maps where you otherwise couldn't, which will allow you to get a much better starting position, but I don't care. I love battle preps, and I think we need more battle preps. Just makes everything more nice and orderly. I've also done some very slight map changes, such as adding a door in Chapter 3 so that you can get to the village with Lou a little bit easier. And in Chapter 8, which I think is one of the more tediously designed chapters in the game, I've added a crack in the wall on the right-hand side so you can reach the middle a little faster. However, I've also placed some pretty scary stationary guards in the vicinity so that if you want to take that path, you'll have to fight through some pretty powerful enemies. I have also reworked the two last chapters of the game. They no longer just feature Manakeets. I've actually placed some various units here and there to make the enemies a little bit more interesting, and I have made some pretty significant changes to the final boss fight. I'm not going to tell you what I did, you'll simply have to find out for yourself, but good luck. That's all I'm going to say. This boss fight is stupidly hard now. Now let's move over to the unit changes. I've only changed the units I feel are desperately in need of a buff. And here's the caveat, I have not touched a single growth rate. The only thing I've changed about playable units are slight modification to their base stats and sometimes levels. Starting with Roy, the only change I've done is to give him a +2 bonus to his speed, so he now has a base speed of 9. He also comes with an iron sword in his starting inventory now, so you can conserve that rapier a little bit more in the early game. I've also made it so that Roy promotes at the end of Chapter 16. This means you will get a Master Lord Roy going into the Sakai/Ilia route split, but keep in mind that Roy still doesn't get his Binding Blade until Chapter 21, so he'll still be sword locked and foot locked, however his stats will now be unshackled and you can level him up further. The next unit I have buffed is Boris. I have given him +2 speed, and that's pretty much the only thing I've done to him. With enemies being weaker on hard mode, he should have a much easier time, but the problem with Boris at base is that his low speed means he gets doubled by some axe users, and being an armor knight, this just absolutely kills his early game. Now with the extra speed, he should be able to keep up. He might even be able to double some enemies if he grows speed early on, so I think this change does more than enough to make Boris viable. Again, I've made very small changes to these units because I feel like one of the biggest issues you can do is to go overboard or overboarse. I'll show myself out. But yeah, I feel like this change should make him more viable in the early game. The next unit that I have buffed is Wolt, and with Wolt I have given him a very simple +2 strength and +2 speed. Now keep in mind the enemies are also weaker in the early game, so that +2 speed will actually make him double quite a few enemies early on. And the thing about Wolt is that his growth rates are actually pretty good, so once you can snowball him properly, he becomes a pretty good sniper. It's just that he really struggles on hard mode because enemies are so strong and he hardly deals damage. Now, however, with +2 speed and +2 strength, he should be a lot better at that, and he should start snowballing a lot earlier.
While I haven't changed Elen or Lance, as I feel they're fine just the way they are, I have done a very small change to Marcus. He now begins with a steel blade in his inventory instead of an iron sword. The reason behind this is that with the new hard mode bonuses, Marcus with an iron sword will double and one-round most axe users for quite a few chapters. This makes him unable to set up kills for the rest of the team, which is one of the reasons he is so useful on hard mode. The steel blade slows him down to the point where he won't double most axe-wielding enemies, and this allows him to weaken them so that the scrubs can pick up kills.
Up next is Elen. I've done a very simple change to her. She now has +2 base magic. Elen's magic growth is actually pretty good, but her base magic of 1 is pitiful. It makes it very hard for her to top off people with her healing in the early game, and she usually gets benched in favor of better healers like Clarine later on. So this change should help her stay a little bit more relevant. Up next are the fighters, and I don't think it will come as a big surprise that I buffed them both. With Wade, I have given him +2 bonus to his base speed. That is Wade's biggest issue, is the fact that he can't really double that well, so this should help him do that, especially combined with the weaker enemies in the early game. With Lot, I have given him a +2 bonus to his base strength. Lot's biggest issue is that his strength is kind of weak, and his strength growth is a little bit low, and you know, he still has pretty decent speed, pretty decent defense, so he'll be a pretty tanky fast fighter, but this should help him out a lot in the early game. Now, one thing I want to add very quickly is that while I haven't nerfed any playable characters in this balance patch, you might notice that Rutger is slightly weaker on hard mode, and this is because I've nerfed the enemy's hard mode bonuses of this map, and I do believe this will affect Rutger in a very slight way. He might have had 9 strength in Vanilla FE6 here, for example. However, he will still be an absolute titan, and you should definitely use him. This shouldn't amount to more than maybe 1 or 2 stat points, but just something that I would like to add. The next unit I've buffed, and this should come as no surprise to any of you either, is of course Dorothy, and I've given Dorothy the same bonuses that I gave to Wolt, +2 strength and +2 speed. However, I also gave her +2 skill, because one of Dorothy's biggest issues is that, you know, her bases are just very bad, and she joins so much later than Volt's, so Wolt is a lot easier to train because he has multiple chapters to build himself up. Dorothy does not have that luxury. She can be a little bit useful in the upcoming chapter, however, she's very inaccurate with a steel bow. That's why I gave her the extra +2 skill as well. Also, I didn't make any changes to Saul, but I did put an unlock staff in his inventory because this chapter has 1,000,000 doors and you only have 1 thief, and it makes me want to kill myself. Yes, I know you can buy door keys in the previous chapter, but I don't care. Like, the unlock staff only has 3 uses anyway. Up next is Sue, and I've given Sue +2 strength so that she can deal a little bit more damage in the early game. Sue is actually a pretty good unit, I find. She's very useful to train. She doubles pretty much everything, and her avoidance is godlike. However, she has really poor strength, and she struggles dealing any real damage. So with that +2 bonus, it should just be a lot easier for her to get kills, and this should make her snowball a little bit faster. So up next is Treck. I think we can all agree that both Treck and Noah are in a pretty tough spot. Both of them, they just really struggle to stand out. And since Treck is supposed to be the quote-unquote tanky cavalier, the change I've done to him is quite simple. I've given him +3 base defense. So he has 11 base defense right now. That is as much as Garret have. So Treck is by far one of your tankiest cavaliers in the game right now. If you train him up, he will be an absolute beast. He will shrug off damage like it's nothing. However, his offensive stats are still quite weak, and I think that's warranted if you're going to have the defense of an armor knight. But right now, Treck has a very specific niche. He is incredibly tough to kill. And up next, I have, of course, changed Noah. Noah is supposed to be the jack of all trades cavalier. He's supposed to kind of like be the guy who doesn't have any great strengths, but he doesn't have any weaknesses either. So I've given him a very simple +1 to all of his stats, including hit points. So he's still kind of mediocre, he's still kind of average, he still struggles to stand out. However, he now has marginally better stats in every single area. Again, I wanted to keep the units the same, I wanted them to feel the same, I just wanted them to have a little bit more of a specific niche. Next up, I have buffed the entire Ostian Scrub Squad, starting with Barth. Now, with Barth, I didn't really want to change what makes him unique. I didn't want to change his resistance or give him extra speed. I think Barth's primary issue in Fire Emblem 6 is that he can't hit things. He has a base skill of 6, so with like a Steel or an Iron Lance, he just cannot hit anything. And when you can't hit things, you can't get experience and you can't level up. So I've doubled his base skill from 6 up to 12, so he should have a lot of an easier time hitting things now, which should make training him a lot easier as well. I haven't changed him in any other way. I think Barth is a fun meme unit and he should stay that way, but now he should at the very least be able to hit things. Also keep in mind that Steel Lances have been buffed to their FE7 values right now, so with 70 hit on his Steel Lance and a base skill of 12, Barth's hit rates should actually be pretty solid right now. He should feel a little bit more like Fire Emblem 7 Oswin, maybe not as powerful, but at least a little bit more comparable in terms of his combat early on. And you, Wendy fanboys, I haven't forgotten about you. I have, of course, given her a little bit of a buff. With Wendy, I haven't really changed her that much. I've given her +4 skill and +4 speed, so her base skill and speed is now 7. This should do a couple of things, should make it a lot easier for her to get kills, because she can actually hit things, and she will reach a point where she is able to double enemies much quicker, which is the whole point of Wendy. You know, the whole appeal of Wendy is if you train her up, you get an Armor Knight and eventually a General that can double, and Wendy was always able to reach that point on her own, but now she should reach it a lot quicker, so it shouldn't take as long babying Wendy. Now, you will still need to baby her a lot to train her, which I think is the whole appeal of Wendy, but with her new base skill and speed, she should get to the point she needs to be at much quicker, making the process a lot less tedious. It will still be tedious though. Wendy fanboys, you still have to suffer a little bit. I'm not just gonna give you a free est, you'll need to work for it, but I think you're fine with this. And then, of course, we have Ogier. Now, it was tough for me to find a way to buff him without just making him a better Deke. I think that Ogier shouldn't be as strong as Deke. His whole appeal is that you have to train him up and you get like a marginally better Deke if you do so. So I figured, you know, what is Ogier's one redeeming trait over Deke? Well, it's the fact that he has a lot more luck than him. That's kind of like his strength. So I just took that and I made it even better in that area. I buffed his base luck by 6. He now has 12 base luck as opposed to 6. So the whole appeal of training Ogier right now is that you get a hero in the late game that has a chance of capping his luck. I should become relatively close to being able to reach the luck cap of 30, which should make him ridiculously dodgy and practically impossible to crit. So I felt like this was a good way to take Ogier, take that one niche that made him stand out from Deke and just enhance that so that he now feels a lot more unique. I still think Deke will be a lot better than him because you get him in so many chapters earlier and his bases are just better than Ogier despite joining earlier, but at least now Ogier has a niche that feels very distinct and maybe it will incentivize a few more players to actually give him a chance. Next up is a very tiny buff to Lilina. I will add that while I have restored most weapons back to their FE7 values, I have retained the low weight of animatomes. I feel like changing tome weight back to FE7 will be screwing over every single magic user in this game, and I don't want to do that. However, despite anima magic being very strong in Binding Blade, I am also giving Lilina a tiny buff to her survivability. I'm not touching her skill or speed or anything like that. I actually think she's fine and she'll become quite good if you train her. However, with base 16 HP and 2 defense, enemies are very likely to one-shot her, and that makes training her quite a pain. And considering you're getting her so late, I'm giving her a very simple +2 base HP. This should make her less likely to get one-shotted by certain enemies, which will in turn make training her a lot less tedious. Up next, I've given a small buff to Fear. This probably wasn't necessary, honestly, because I think Fear is actually pretty good once you train her up to a Swordmaster, but I'm a shameless Fear fanboy and I'm not afraid to admit that. So I've given Fear +2 base strength and +2 base speed. Now the stats you see here may vary a little bit from yours because of hard mode bonuses, but overall I felt like Fear needed a little bit of a boost to strength because she has a really low strength growth and it can screw her over quite a bit. And the reason why I gave her +2 speed, despite her being very fast
fast at base is because it just helps her against some of the more faster enemies on the Western Isles. She might actually be able to double those now, but she'll still cap speed as a Myrmidon and a Swordmaster, so it's not really going to affect her late game performance. However, the +2 strength will help her quite a bit in terms of dealing damage. And I do think this is needed because she joins quite late and quite underleveled, so if you want to take your time training up Fear, this will be a little bit easier now.
Next up is a unit I think we all agree is in need of a big buff. It is Geese. His old bases just left so much to be desired. They were just mediocre all around. He didn't have a single stat above 10, which is extremely bad. And I know Geese has a very strong promotion, and that's why I took care not to buff him too much, but I still gave him +2 strength, +2 skill, and +2 speed. And this combined with the increased hit rate to Axis should just make him much more of a solid unit. Now, I will very quickly add that I have not buffed Gonzales in any way. However, he is still a lot stronger in this patch, since all Axis have had their hit rates buffed, and this kind of fixes one of Gonzales' biggest weaknesses, which is accuracy. So again, while I haven't touched him, he's still a lot stronger. I have also taken some creative liberties with this patch, since I am Mangs, but honestly, I think this will just make it a lot more fun. Now, while I haven't changed Echidna in any way, I have changed her starting event. It now plays on turn 9 player phase rather than turn 8 enemy phase. This means that Echidna comes out and nothing happens. They don't actually jump her like they do in the original. This means that she has no chance of just spawning and instantly dying. This was one of the biggest annoyances I had with Vanilla FE6, despite this chapter being one of my favorites. Another thing I've done with Echidna to make her recruitment less of a headache is to change out her steel axe to an iron axe. This essentially gives her 5 extra points of speed and makes her a lot more likely to dodge the incoming attacks. And oh yeah, by the way, while I haven't changed Klein in any way, I did change his AI. So instead of having that 50% chance to act crap that he had before, he now moves 100% of the time. So it should be a lot easier to recruit him now. Now up next is Bartre. Bartre is a character that I actually think is a little underrated in Vanilla FE6. He has an absolutely massive base strength of 22, which is the highest in the entire game. So he hits like an absolute truck. However, I do agree that his base skill and speed leaves a lot to be desired. So I've increased his skill and speed by +3 each. So now he should have a little bit of an easier time hitting things, and while his speed won't be high enough for him to double a lot of enemies, at least he won't get doubled by enemies in his joining chapter. With the 13 base speed, he should keep up a little bit easier. He'll still probably get to a point in the endgame where he'll get doubled by promoted enemies, but I think honestly that's fine for Bartre, considering he starts out so incredibly strong. But yeah, my goal isn't to make pre-promotes like insane or anything, just to make them keep up with your army a little bit more than they currently are on hard mode. Up next is Raigh, and while I think Raigh is actually pretty good in Binding Blade, the problem with him is that he really just struggles to stand out. He doesn't really have the cute waifu-est potential that Sophia has, and if you want a solid Apocalypse user in the endgame, then Niime fills that role. So I thought a little bit about how I could make Raigh more interesting, and I simply decided to give him hard mode bonuses. This is always something that bothered me about Raigh. He's a red unit that doesn't get hard mode bonuses because he starts out on the map. So yeah, I just spawned him in as a reinforcement, and that makes him get hard mode bonuses. I may have made him a little too broken, but it might be fun. So up next we have Cath, and Cath is just a very weird unit in Fire Emblem 6. I mean, she's incredibly convoluted to recruit. You gotta talk to her 3 times over the course of 3 different maps. And even when you get her, all you get is kind of like the worst thief in the game, which is such a shame. You know, Chad at least has the advantage of joining really early, so you can train him up if you want to. And Astolfo has the advantage of being extremely durable for a thief. And Cath, she has good growth rates, but then again, she can't promote, because thieves can't promote in Fire Emblem 6. And by the way, I have not made them promote in this patch. I don't want to import rogues into this. I feel like that's a little bit too gimmicky. I figured, you know, the best way to make a Cath stand out is to give her a niche, and that's why I amped her luck up to 20, and it's going to go even higher if you play on hard mode. Actually, the later you recruit her, the higher her luck will be, because hard mode bonuses go up over time. So now you will get a thief that will cap speed, and very reliably cap luck as well. So she will have the most avoid out of any thief in the game. You know, Chad has early join time, Astolfo has great defense, Cath has godlike avoid. That's gonna be her niche right now. Now up next is a character I know you are all gonna be very interested in, and that is Sophia. Of course, Sophia is just incredible garbage in Fire Emblem 6. I mean, probably one of the worst units in Fire Emblem history. Her stats are so bad for her joining time, and even when you train her, she doesn't really turn out that great. So I've justified a pretty huge buff to Sophia. She gets a flat +3 bonus to every single one of her bases. And even with this change, she's not going to be great. Trust me, guys, she will still die in this chapter. If the Wyverns get near her, they will still one-shot her. So you'll still need to be very careful with Sophia, but at least now if you want to train her, she's a lot less of a headache to train. And I think, honestly, that is what Sophia fans want. They don't want a Sophia that's strong from the get-go. They still want to train her up into an amazing unit, and if you do train her up now, she will become kind of decent, I guess. But she's still very weak. She's just not as trash as she used to be. Up next is maybe one of the biggest changes I've done to the ROM, but also one of the ones I'm most proud of. Igrene now joins you in Chapter 14, replacing Cecilia, who in my story is still recovering from the wounds inflicted on her by Sophia. Don't worry, I've modified the story a little bit to reflect this, so it shouldn't be awkward. Since Igrene is the guardian of Nabata, I figured it would make sense for her to take part in the actual Nabata chapter. While I haven't increased her stats, she comes with a torch in her starting inventory to help her out in the sandstorm, and she also has a unique ability to traverse the desert without taking a movement penalty, something no other sniper in the game can do. This ability will only help her out in this chapter, since it is the only desert chapter in the game, but it will make her feel very unique and give her a very good first impression. Not to mention her killer bow will be very useful against the Wyverns of this chapter. Now, to all you Cecilia fanboys, don't worry, I gotcha covered. As I said, she now joins in Chapter 15 instead, which is a much better start for her since the desert is horrible for her mounted movement. And in terms of her stats, I think we can all agree that Cecilia is one of the weakest pre-promoted units of all time. So I've given her a pretty hefty buff of +4 to magic, skill, and speed. I mean, she's the goddamn mage general. I think she should be a lot better at fighting than she currently is. A well-trained Klein will still overtake her in time, but this Cecilia is a lot more competent at fighting with her A rank in magic. She can do very well against Wyverns with her Excalibur tome, and she's actually even a decent potential 4-blaze user. Not to mention she'll be a great support unit with her healing and rescue utility. She will eventually fall off into the late game, but with these changes, Cecilia should remain useful for a majority of the mid game. Up next is Garret, the berserker everyone enjoys sleeping on. Now I am showing him on hard mode here, just to be clear. Now, Garret's biggest issue is his speed. He's just incredibly slow, which makes him very hard to use. So I've given him +3 base speed, putting his speed up to around 14. It can differ a little bit depending on your bonuses, but with 14 base speed, Garret still won't reliably double enemies, but he shouldn't get doubled as easily, which was one of his biggest issues. The fact that he was so slow, he might actually end up getting doubled by some enemies, and we don't want that, especially not for a pre-promote. I've also put a Devil Axe into his starting inventory, because you only get a single Devil Axe in FE6, and I think that's way too little, so now you get another one. So up next is the great General Douglas, and Douglas really struggles with two things. His base skill is incredibly low, so he can't really hit things, which is really bad. And his base speed is so low, he risks getting doubled by enemies, which kind of puts a halt to his tankiness. Like, if an unpromoted mage comes up to him, he might get doubled, and that could just take out so many of his hit points. So I've increased his speed by 3 points and his skill by 3 points. So now he should have an easier time hitting things, which allow him to get a little bit of experience. And his base speed of 11 is still pretty poor, and he might still get doubled by some enemies, and he definitely will not double, but at least he should avoid getting doubled by some generic mages, which is one of his biggest weaknesses in my opinion. Up next is Hugh, and Hugh is just in a really tricky spot. He joins so incredibly late, and he just can't really do much, and you have to pay 10,000 gold if you want him at his strongest, which is just too much to pay for a mage at this point during the game. So I've done a very simple fix to him. I simply promoted him. So these are the stats he will get if you just instantly get him a guiding ring when he first joins, which I think is pretty alright for a level 1 sage in Binding Blade. Like, Binding Blade actually doesn't have a single pre-promoted sage, which I think is very strange. Yeah, you'll have 17 base magic and 13 base speed, which I think is pretty good, considering Animatomes weigh next to nothing. So I guess you could kind of say that the recruitment cost for Hugh right now is 5,000 gold rather than 10,000, because you basically get a free guiding ring when you get him. And in case you're curious, I did give him D rank in staves, so he can use men staves at base. So he's actually a pretty good healer now. Up next, we have Niime, and don't worry, I haven't buffed or nerfed her bases in any way. All I've done with Niime is reduce her base level to 15. This means that instead of having 2 levels to grow, she now has 5 levels, so more than twice as much. Now with her piss poor growth rates, this is not really going to affect her stats that much. Niime is lucky if she gets like hit points and magic when she levels up. However, I think it's kind of boring when characters cap out early. It means they won't get any more experience, and I just like seeing the little bar go up every time they do things. So by nerfing Niime's level, it just means that you'll have more fun using her into the late game, and she won't hit level 20 quite as early. And at the end of the day, maybe it'll give her like 1 or 2 extra stats, but it shouldn't really affect her performance in any way. So anyway, it's just like a fun little change I've done to Niime. It should be a little bit more enjoyable to use her into the late game now. Up next, we have Juno. She's a pretty forgettable Falconite in this game because her stats aren't really that good. Primarily, her strength is really low and she struggles dealing any damage. So that's the thing I buffed about her. She now has +3 strength, so her base strength is now 14. This should allow her to hit a little harder. I've also given her a much better sword rank. She has C rank in swords right now. She does a lot better than what she used to have, so she can actually use the killing edge at base, for example. However, she still will not be as strong as a trained Thea or Shanna, which she shouldn't be. But now she can at least do damage, which she couldn't do before. And up next, we have Dayan, and just like Juno, I think Dayan's main issue is his low base strength. I mean, he's pretty fast, and he's got very decent hit points. His defense is even kind of good for a Nomad Trooper, but he just struggles to damage things with his low base strength. So I've given him +4 base strength, so now his strength is 18. So with that, he's able to do a lot more damage than he was previously, and I think this is a good change to Dayan. He's still nowhere near as good as a trained Shin or Su, which he shouldn't be, but now he can actually put a little bit of a dent in enemies. Up next is Yoder, and just like with Niime, I simply reduced his base level from 20 down to 15. One of the things that I think a lot of people don't like about Yoder is that he joins capped on levels, so he doesn't get any experience, he can never grow. He's still a pretty useful unit, but I think a lot of people don't like using him because the bar doesn't go up whenever he does things. Now the bar will go up. I mean, his growth rates are still bad. He still won't get more than maybe like 1 or 2 stats per level, but at least now he has 5 levels to play around with. So using him should feel a little bit more rewarding, and I think this will just incentivize people to give Yoder a bit of a chance, which I think is fine. With Karel, I've also reduced his base level slightly, from 19 down to 17. Yes, I am aware that this gives him 2 extra levels with those insane growth rates, but honestly I don't think he's going to be that broken despite of this, as Karel is kinda bad in his current state, and he could use the buff. Karel is supposed to be your crutch for killing dragons in the late game, and he'll be able to do that a lot better now. However, he will require some experience to do so. To wrap things up, I've done one last change to the ROM that is there just for fun. I've mixed up the soundtrack a little bit. Mainly, I've cut down on the amount of times Beyond the Distant Skies play. Don't get me wrong, it's a very iconic Fire Emblem track, but Fire Emblem 6 uses it way too much. I haven't added any new music to the ROM, I've just used tracks that are already there in the game's codes. Here's a few examples. Now lastly, I'm going to show you guys how to get the ROM. In the video description of this video there are 2 links. One which lets you download a UPS patch directly that you can use to patch a Japanese Fire Emblem 6 ROM. However, if you don't like patching ROMs, there's also an invite link to a Discord server called the Manx Hacking Archive. This server isn't run by me, but by a good friend of mine. Here you can find downloads to all previous ROM hacks I've done, and you can download the ROMs directly. You will find the Fire Emblem 6 ROM under Other Downloads, along with a Google document that has all the info you might need. You cannot chat in the server, it merely exists as a download hub, but this is where my future ROM hack Andran Saga will be released as well, so it's not a bad server to know about. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, so that is it. I must admit, this video became a lot longer than I thought it would be. I thought it was just going to be like a 5-minute video, but it ended up being 30 minutes. Now, I don't want to give you guys the illusion that this is something that I've been working on for like a year or so. This is literally something that took me like 3 to 4 days to make. I haven't properly play tested it, so I hope it's not filled with bugs, although all I've done is just modify base stats. I don't really see why there would be any bugs, but you never know. If you do find any bugs, definitely let me know about it in the comment section and I'll go fix it. But again, the reason why I made this patch isn't because I feel like FE6 needs to be balanced. I think FE6 works fine just the way it is, but I think that if you are going to apply a balance change to it, this is how I would do it. I see a lot of these Redux patches, I see what Project Ember did, I see a lot of these attempts to fix FE6, and I feel like all of them kind of go in the wrong direction. The goal of this particular balance patch is to create something that fundamentally still feels like Fire Emblem 6 at its very core, that still gives you the same joys as Fire Emblem 6 gives you. This is a balance patch intended for people who already love Fire Emblem 6, and the purpose is just to give you a bit more of a streamlined gaming experience and to make some of those incredibly irrelevant characters that no one ever uses, to actually give them a little bit of a purpose. And of course, you know, you have the challenge at the end game. You know, the last boss fight is ridiculously hard, and I think you guys are really going to struggle with it. And if any of you actually manage to beat it, definitely make a video of yourself fighting the final boss and send it to me, and I will definitely have a blast watching that, because I think I may have made the boss fight really hard, maybe even impossible. We'll see. Anyway, guys, have fun with this little thing that I made. I'm looking forward to hearing you guys' experience about it in the comment section below. And let me know if there were any units that you were tempted to use and if you had any success with them. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Manx. Thank you so much for watching. Go play the ROM. Have fun.